Hej alle sammen, jeg skal snakke engelsk. Så det her det bliver altså så det sidste, jeg siger på dansk. But I'm going to talk about multilingualism in subtitling, as Klaus was saying. And the reason for that is that things have changed. It used to be like this when I grew up, that everybody spoke English regardless of what language they were supposed to be speaking. And I want to say, before I begin, I have begun, I realize that, but before I begin properly, I want to say thank you to Natasha for setting all the basics, because I'm not going to do that. So that means if you have never had Subtitling 101, and we can sort of talk about multilingualism and that. So, because of the theme of today's workshop, I thought it would be good and appropriate to talk about multiple languages in audiovisual translation and in subtitling. And it used to be the case that you had one film, one language. You were watching a German film, and then it was translated from German to Danish or to Swedish or whatever. But that's not really the case anymore, is it? I mean, when I was growing up, we had shows like this one, which I thought was hilariously funny. But in which all the languages, German, Italian, French, English, and so on, were just represented by accents. So you had all the French people were speaking English with a French accent, and that meant they were speaking French, so the other people speaking English with other accents didn't understand them. And then you have very posh English accents to signal that they were actually speaking English. So very funny, but not that realistic, though, was it? And then moved on into the 90s, where we had films like Braveheart, where they sort of tried to represent different languages in a different way. So this is set in medieval Scotland, so this Australian-American Mel Gibson fellow was speaking Scottish English. But the case is, though, in medieval times, he would have spoken Gaelic. And all the English overlords were speaking RP, received pronunciation, whereas they would have actually spoken medieval French. But still, they tried to represent, by using the means of today, to represent language diversity in the Middle Ages. But just 10 years later, Mel Gibson, I'm not going to talk about Mel Gibson all the time, but he made this movie in 2004, and then something had changed. So around the millennium, things started changing. And in this film, they were speaking sort of the languages that they would have spoken in biblical times. So they're speaking Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. So actual language representation. And this has, and I'm not saying that this is Mel Gibson's doing, it's just films that can illustrate this development. And now it's quite common for sort of language realism, if you will. So I don't know if you've seen this one. It's quite a good action thriller thing on Netflix, which is set half of the time in Israel and half the time in the US. And when they're in Tel Aviv, they're speaking Hebrew. When in America, they're speaking English. Because that's what people in Tel Aviv and New York do. So it's just... And also the film, the movie that won all the Oscars this year, I mean, the central family there are Chinese immigrants, so when they talk about each other, they talk Chinese. It's just because that's sort of realistic what they would do. Then the rest of the film isn't realistic at all, but that's a different story. And then even further, I think this has the record. It's a TV series about a migrant ship going to America, and it has 7 central languages, because that's what the various immigrants from the various countries would speak. So people no longer put up with just me speaking English with a French accent. Eh? That was Italian accent for some reason, but yeah. You get my drift. People are not buying into that anymore. So I was sort of interested in seeing how subtitles reflect this. And the long and the short of it is that they don't. And possibly they should. So I normally just describe, I'm from the descriptive paradigm, so that means that I just describe what people are doing. But today I'm actually going to make a few suggestions for change. So that's a first for me, actually. But if we look to we need some background. Dubbing has dealt a lot more with multilingualism in films than subtitling has done. And that's to do with how you define the text. I'm not going into any great detail of this, but the difference between dubbing and subtitling is, of course, that in dubbing you replace the dialogue and have source text dialogue. So if you have, and you don't in subtitling, so that means that you can hear the original dialogue in subtitling, and you can hear that people are speaking Chinese or if they're speaking American. So that's the idea. Whereas if you dub the thing, then you have to recreate this multilingualism in the translated dialogue, which means that a lot more research has gone into multilingualism in dubbing. So dubbing has to recreate multilingualism, whereas subtitling represents it or not. What I found is that most of the time it doesn't. So a few definitions, so just that you can follow me. The L1 is the main language of the film or the TV program in its original. The L2 is the main language of the film or TV program in its translated form, whether dubbed or subtitled. And the L3 is basically any other language, whether in the source or the target text. So if you look at what people do when they create multilingual films, how they handle L3 in the source text, in the original films. Well, Sternberg says that there is a continuum from homogenization to vehicular matching, and nobody understands what that means. But basically, homogenization is allo. That's basically everybody speaking English. Vehicular matching sounds like it means you're going to find a car you like, but it doesn't. It basically means you're going for linguistic realism. So that's what you find in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. So if people are Chinese, they speak Chinese. And sometimes, particularly in the 1980s and before that, people used to do a lot of what's known as postcarding. You know when but people don't write postcards anymore, do they? But if you go on a holiday to Spain, then you may send a postcard back writing aloha, hola. So got stuck in the aloha there. You write hola and hasta la vista. Just a few phrases in Spanish just to show that you're in fact in Spain. And that's what some movie makers were doing as well. So there's just a few phrases just to signal that these people are actually speaking Spanish. And these things were handled either intra or extradiegetically, which meant that either some character explains it for you or you get subtitles, basically. So if someone is speaking in a foreign language that other people in the film don't understand, then one of the characters would say, well, he was saying that, and then he sort of interprets it for you. Or you have part subtitling, like you would have in like Dances with Wolves, for instance. So the Lakota was then in subtitles in the original English version, and then they're normally very often burnt in, so you also get them with the Danish version and so on. So that's how they handle it in the source text. How do we then handle it in subtitling at the current time? Well, you could just translate it and don't mark it at all. So if you have something which is in Chinese and English, then you just translate it to Danish regardless of whether they're speaking English or Danish, and you don't mark it at all. Or you could mark it in one way or another. You can mark it by not translating it, just leaving no subtitles there, if you're not supposed to understand what they're saying. Or you can mark it by transcription, so you write it in the original language in your subtitles. Or you could translate it into Danish using italics to show that this is, in fact, in a foreign language. And the idea is that it should be the same as for the source audience. So if the source audience was supposed to know what they were saying in the L3, the other language, then that should be the same in the translated version. But we all know that there is an invisibility ideal in subtitling. De gode tekster er dem, man aldrig mærker. Eh? Okay, the good subtitles are those that you never notice. And that means that we tend to favor option one, not to mark them, just to put everything there in Danish. And then just hope that people understand that can actually hear that they're speaking in a foreign language. Unless you're doing SDH, subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing. If we look internationally, there are ways of marking this, because deaf people can't hear if they're speaking English or Chinese. So then you could use bracket annotation, saying in French or in Chinese, or sometimes you can also use colors to mark different languages. So for the subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing, you do get some annotation about which language is spoken, just as you can get annotation about how things are said, whispering, for instance, or mumbling in Swedish, staring in Korean, yeah, that sort of thing. Okay, so a lot of research has gone into multilingualism in dubbing. Stavroulos Soukoulis has looked into the functions, and there are many functions. It used to be that you had a bit of L3 for showing that someone was from a foreign country, or for making it funny, or for dramatic effect, or loads of things. And those used to be specific functions for specific L3 utterances in a language, in a film that normally just had the one language. But that is no longer true, I find, because now you don't have L3 for a specific function, not just for a joke or for dramatic effect or for showing that he is in fact the baddie. What you're doing now with L3 is to show that people actually speak different languages. So it's just because it's natural. People speak different languages, and therefore we have different languages in film. So specific utterances don't have specific foreign languages for a specific function anymore. Okay, so if we look into the guidelines and how to deal with L3 in subtitling then. These are the Netflix guidelines, but they basically all agree on this. I've looked into several company guidelines. And they say, well, as I said before, if the original viewers were supposed to understand the L3, then the subtitling viewers should also. And you should make sure you spell it correctly. And you can use italics to mark them, unless they're loanwords. But that's not good advice for the current situation either. I mean, you can't have like half the film in italics, because then you use up, and italics is supposed to do other things in subtitling as well. You use it for signaling internal monologues or people on the phone, very many things. So you can't use the italics if people are speaking as much Chinese as they're speaking English. So that's not very helpful either. Well, and when I speak to people, when I started to talk to people about this, they say, well, that's not a problem in subtitling. God, no, stop being a nuisance, yeah? Because viewers can hear the difference. Of course they can. I mean, I can show, when I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once, I could hear when they were speaking Chinese, that they were speaking Chinese, sure. And also you have visual clues. So if they're wearing a Nazi uniform, they're probably speaking German. Yeah? All stereotypes and very mean, yeah. And it's not a problem for the subtitlers either. They don't have to know the L3 because they have it all translated into English in the EMTs. So you just translate from English, no problem at all. Now, being an academic, I used to be a subtitler, mind you. I was a subtitler for about 10 years, but I just realized I've been a researcher of subtitles for more than 20 years, so I'm basically a researcher now rather than a subtitler. So being an academic and a researcher, I like to problematize things and say, is it really not a problem in subtitling? Because for subtitlers, well, you have the EMTs, but if you don't understand the source language, can you really trust the EMTs? I mean, we know that they are not accurate all the time, right? I look at the subtitles here, no, they're not accurate all the time. And also segmentation becomes problematic, because if you don't understand what they're saying, how do you know which bit goes where? And also you get interference from English. And we saw that with the Squid Game controversy and so on. So if you don't understand the original language, you go through English, then someone has made a translation choice in English, and then you get what they call compound errors when you go through several language versions. And what about the viewers then? Well, yes, you can listen and hear that another language is heard, but it takes a bit of effort. So going back to Everything Everywhere All at Once, I know the difference between English and Chinese. I do, I really do. But since I was getting, and I'm not alone in this, I'm sure, since I was getting my verbal input via the subtitles, I actually had to switch modes and use my ears, the input through my ears, to realize that they were speaking Chinese. So that's more of an effort for the viewers. And also, what about the deaf and hard of hearing? You don't get language annotation in interlingual subtitling. You only get that with the SDH. And in Danish and Swedish and basically all languages except for English, you don't get annotation with interlingual subtitles. And most of the things that deaf people are watching is actually interlingual subtitles. I've had a doctoral student of mine, Hannah Hagström, actually checked this out, and 2/3 of the time they're actually reading interlingual subtitles because they're watching the same programs as we do, and we like to watch foreign films. So they can't hear that something else is going on, a different language. And visual clues can be devious. I was watching a very good Danish film called Skyggen i mit øje, which is set here in Copenhagen, among other places, during the occupation, Pedersen, in World War II. And then you had this thing with people in Nazi uniforms speaking German. But then you also had Danish Nazis in uniforms speaking Danish. So if you don't know, you have to know what the uniforms look like if you can't tell the difference between Danish and German. And I can do that, yes, but not all people can, and definitely not people who can't hear. And can you really tell the difference? I mean, there is a movie that premieres tonight, which is called Love Life, which is bilingual, which is in Japanese and Korean. I might watch that, but I don't think I can tell the difference. Not if I'm going to enjoy the movie and not just focus on the language. And I don't know the difference between Hindi and Punjabi. And I mean, we have a global movie market now. We're not just watching English movies anymore. We're watching movies from all over the place. And there hasn't been a lot of them yet, but there will be a lot of them. And I don't know the difference between Ukrainian and Russian. And that's going to be important, because you need to know who are the goodies and who are the baddies, right? So I'm just going to do an experiment with you here now and show you a sequence from the film Quo Vadis Aida, which is set during the wars of former Yugoslavia. It's about the massacre at Srebrenica. I won't give too much content now because I speak too slowly. I don't speak too slowly, but I have too much to say. Anyway, this is a meeting in Srebrenica. The guy at the end of the table is General Mladic, and then there is, so this is a meeting with General Mladic, the UN representative, which is a Dutch colonel, and some local people from Srebrenica. So see if you can tell how many languages is spoken in this. Okay, I just pulled the wrong button here. Okay, I did it again.
Mladic, present here are the representatives of the residents of Srebrenica. Under Resolution 819, Srebrenica is a safe area under protection of the United Nations.
Generale, ovo su predstavnici civila iz Srebrenice koji se nalaze u našoj bazi. Prema rezoluciji 819 UN...
Šta ste vi, gospođo, po profesiji?
Ekonomista. Imam 2 djece i 1 unuka.
Već tako mlada baka.
Baka, jes. S vašim kolegom sam bila u razredu.
Onda ja vam ne trebam, a?
Ne trebate.
Možete vi da rešite problem.
Okay, so you just got the Swedish subtitles, which didn't notice, give you any clue as to what languages. So how many languages were spoken? 4? Which were the 4 languages? I don't know. Okay, you were just giving a number, okay? No, English was definitely part of it. So English, yes, that's right. The Dutch colonel was speaking English. Serbian. Yes, Serbian. And Bosnian. Yes. Back in the day, of course, they were known as Serbo-Croat, but they are today different languages, and they were definitely different language varieties as well back then. And I had a friend of mine who's a Serb check this, and also a friend of mine who's a Bosnian check this. And here it's very important because the Serbs are the bad guys, and the Bosnians are sort of the good guys. And even some local people are actually Bosnian Serbs, so it's very complicated. And we don't get a clue about this at all in the Swedish subtitles. And you have to know the full story and actually keep up to know who are the good and who are the bad guys in this. So, I mean, let's face it, we couldn't tell the difference between Serbian and Bosnian, could we? I mean, no, unless you're from that area, of course, then it's no problem. Okay, so what can we do about this then? Well, a few things have been tried, different modes. They do that in America a lot, so you dub one language and you subtitle the other. Netflix actually tried that with Hit and Run, the Hebrew-English thing I was telling you about. They used dubbing for one of the languages and subtitling for the other. That didn't go down very well in Sweden because we hate dubbing in Sweden, and also because they dubbed the English and subtitled the Hebrew. And I think it's fair to say that most people in Sweden know English a lot better than they do Hebrew. Also, some people were speaking both Hebrew and English depending on the context, and then they had different voices depending on which language it spoke. So not very useful, I think. You could mark it using italics and so on, or you could use square brackets, as they did with Roma, where they had square brackets for mishteko, which was a bit controversial, but actually useful. But that only works if you just have the two languages, and you need to have a sign like that before you start watching to know what's going on. You could use color coding, and that has actually been researched. Agnieszka Szarkowska and Boskowska have looked into audience reception on this, and they actually found that useful to have different colors for different languages. But then you need to inform people in advance of what colors you're going to use with which languages. You could do outright annotation as they do in SDH, and here's an example from Skuggen i Midaya, the movie I was talking about earlier. This is originally in French because it's from a French girls' school here in Copenhagen, which was accidentally bombed by the Royal Air Force, which was a shame. You see, in the Swedish version, you don't get any annotation saying that it was in French, nor in the interlingual English one, but in the English SDH one, you got in French, in square brackets. But it's only English that has two versions, because English is such a rich language, money-wise, not necessarily linguistically. Okay, so sort of I'm going to sum up and then come up with a humble suggestion, because I think we could possibly change it. And this is not something I normally do. I just, describe what people do. But I think we can all agree, I hope, that things are getting more multilingual. It's getting more linguistically realistic. We know there's much more subtitled use. Natasha talked about that there's a lot more subtitles these days. And subtitles don't reflect the development. They're still back in the day when it was just postcarding, basically. And guidelines is also basically about postcarding. So how about country codes for everyone? If you have it like this, in French, I'm the beautiful Elizabeth of Thuringia, which I think it's Thuringen, is pronounced in English, then you get 11 characters to say that. And that's for the deaf and hard of hearing who normally have a lower reading speed than average. So that means you're going to get very high CPS with this. So that's good, but it's problematic that you get such a high CPS. But if you just have the FR to notice, and we all, I mean, in the age of the internet, we all know these country codes. We know that DK is Denmark, we know that SE is Sweden, and so on, because we all see them in internet addresses and everything. So we know them. So maybe we could use those, or maybe not, because this is just a suggestion, as I said. And now I'm done.